Okay, so
So
this is a three-way paper between yourself, Kiki de Jonge, and Bernard Nijstad.
that's right.
And you are, do you know what, I've wanted to hear this one actually since you first submitted the abstract maybe 18 months ago. I remember being really excited by this one. So, and you're talking about a creative idea is a useful idea towards a Covfefe model of
That's
creativity.
right. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, this presentation was actually inspired by a surprising event 4 years ago. And to be honest, it's still very much a work in progress, which yeah, I'm working on with Kiki de Jonge and Bernard Nijstad, both from the University of Groningen. Now, as we all know, creativity is usually broadly defined as the generation of ideas that are both novel and useful. So a creative idea is thought to be somehow original, surprising, or different from the ordinary, as well as appropriate, feasible, or effective in some way. And both in research and in practice, we tend to give priority to originality. So what we see is that interventions are often aimed at helping people think out of the box, to dare to be different, to stop censoring themselves, and generally get off the path of least resistance and into more exciting and surprising territories. This means that usefulness often gets short shrift, perhaps because it's thought to mostly take care of itself. Because, well, most people don't need to be encouraged to generate useful ideas. In fact, since originality and usefulness tend to be negatively correlated, usefulness is sometimes considered a bit of a challenge to be overcome. So trying to get people to focus a bit more on originality. However, we argue that this, yeah, what we call this neglect of usefulness actually means that we're missing out on something rather important and interesting. And yeah, of course, reality is much more chaotic and dynamic, but the creative process is often divided into a series of stages, starting with something like problem definition, and then moving through different stages and ending when an idea gets implemented. And as we know, most creativity research has traditionally focused on idea generation. But so idea generation is sort of taken as the archetypical creativity task, and a lot of creativity research focuses on stimulating idea generation. But the approach we're taking here aligns more with some recent developments in creativity research, where attention is shifting to the later stages in the creative process. Not so much about how and when people generate creative ideas, but rather what happens to those ideas once they are generated. And Jing Zhao and colleagues have labeled this the receiving side of creativity. And one example of this is research on idea selection. In some of our own research, we've been asking what happens to ideas after a brainstorming session. So brainstorming, of course, is meant to help you come up with a lot of ideas. And the assumption is that having a lot of ideas and expressing or sharing a lot of ideas will, in the end, help you choose a good idea from among them, because there's just more alternatives available. This doesn't really seem to be the case. So measuring the originality and feasibility of ideas that people select after a brainstorm generally shows that they often fail to select their best or most creative ideas. So much so, in fact, that they might as well pick an idea at random and then still perform equally well in terms of originality and feasibility. Now, when presenting this kind of work to colleagues or students, I sometimes get critical questions. Like, for example, who are you to decide what the best idea is? And usually I would answer that, of course, we don't really know which ideas are actually best. We only know which ideas are most creative, given how creativity is defined. And I don't really know how satisfactory that answer is for people, but at least it usually stops them asking tricky questions for a while. Basically, of course, this comes down to a question of construct validity. What do we think we're measuring here? And as several people have pointed out already, construct validity is pretty tricky when it comes to measuring creativity, because there's no objective standard. It's all pretty subjective. And really, the best we can do usually is to demonstrate high levels of inter-rater reliability, showing that whatever we're measuring, at least independent raters agree about it. The underlying assumption, though, still is that we're actually measuring something about the idea. Well, so far so good. And then yeah, Donald Trump happened. What does Donald Trump have to do with this? Well, about 4 years ago, the then president of the United States sent a tweet into the world that caused some confusion and a lot of hilarity. And although the White House tried to spin the story a bit, this by now infamous Covfefe tweet was obviously meaningless and probably a typo. Still, it triggered a lot of responses. So people were just, sorry, messing up my animation here. That's the problem when you set your animations with timings instead of key presses. There we go. So these are some of the responses that Covfefe triggered throughout the world. People were yeah, pretty amazed about it, and people came up with all sorts of hilarious responses, creative products, pictures, memes, songs, animated pictures, etc., etc. People were just going overboard creatively with using Covfefe as some sort of creative input. Now, the sad thing about being a creativity researcher, at least as far as I'm concerned, is that whenever somebody does something really weird or silly, somebody will think they're funny and say, well, it's certainly creative. And in this case, actually, I heard that little voice go off inside my head and then started thinking, yeah, but what if this is actually true? What if it really is creative in a way? Of course, in a classic idea generation task, something like Covfefe would probably be deleted as an invalid response because basically it's meaningless and it's impossible to code. But then again, perhaps we need to reconsider our assumptions here, because when coding an idea, we think or assume that we're coding something about the idea, but we're actually coding our response to the idea. That is, we're coding something about ourselves. And judging by the responses Covfefe triggered, this nonsense word was not only useful, but also not only novel, but also useful for many people, at least as raw material for jokes. So is it possible for something to be meaningless and probably a mistake, as well as creative? We think that in a way it might be, and this is what made us start working on what we now call the generative usefulness model of creativity. Basically, the core of the generative usefulness model can be summarized in 4 propositions. First, in line with what others have said before, we propose that ideas are creative by virtue of their consequences, not their characteristics. So ideas are creative because of what they do, not because of what they are. And second, what creative ideas do is opening up new possibilities for an observer. So that is, a creative idea is an idea that helps you do things or see things or think about things in a new way. Third, this implies that novelty and usefulness are not separate dimensions to be measured separately. They're actually intertwined and should be measured as such. You might say that creative ideas are not just useful and novel, but they are useful in a novel way. In other words, high in what we would call generative usefulness. And then finally, fourth, this approach also implies that subjectivity in creativity ratings is not a problem to be overcome, but it might actually be the essence of creativity measurement. So in our view, differences between raters do not reflect error variance, nor do they reflect differences in evaluation accuracy, but they actually represent actual differences in how creative the idea happens to be for people at that particular moment. Now, elaborating and testing these propositions is one of our goals for the near future, but actually most of these have already been proposed in some form before by other researchers. So for example, regarding subjectivity, one classic example of a theory that takes subjectivity very seriously indeed is Csikszentmihalyi's systems theory. And one of the tenets of this theory, as we know, is that creative ideas are those that are accepted as such by a field. So the creativity of an idea is by definition relative and subjective and may even change over time, which I've always found a very hopeful notion. Clearly, and in line with our approach, systems theory embraces subjectivity rather than trying to explain it away, stating clearly that ideas are creative because of their effects on us. But then we don't really need to limit ourselves to the level of the field. After all, different ideas will have different effects on different observers, not just over time, but at any given moment. And one example of how this may play out during a creative task is found in research on cognitive stimulation in brainstorming. As we know, group brainstorming is not a great idea if you want to stimulate ideational productivity, but there is some potential to it, because under the right circumstances, we can actually be stimulated by hearing other people's ideas. Now, cognitively, these ideas could be seen as a kind of search queue that we use to probe our long-term memory in order to come up with new ideas by using and combining things that we know. But what is it that makes other people's ideas useful? Search queues. Some previous studies have looked at whether people were more likely to get stimulated by highly original ideas or less original ideas, but the results and their underlying reasonings were mixed. Some argue that novel ideas may be more useful search queues because they're more likely to activate less easily accessible knowledge. Then again, other people have argued that novel ideas may be less useful search queues because they are too remote and their overlap with your accessible knowledge is just too limited. Research by Kiki de Jonge has found that individual differences may actually play an important role here. In her studies, where she presented participants with stimulation ideas during a brainstorming session, whether or not people felt stimulated by novel ideas depended on their cognitive needs for autonomy and structure. People with a high need for structure felt more stimulated by common ideas and would rather receive no ideas at all than receiving novel ones. People with a high need for autonomy felt more stimulated by novel ideas and would rather receive no ideas than common ones. And for all of these people, the degree to which they felt stimulated by ideas was mediated by the perceived creativity of ideas. So we would interpret these results as showing that the perceived creativity of ideas really is a matter of generative usefulness, and that this may well depend on a match between person and idea, and definitely not just on the idea itself. Now, of course, time is limited here, and so suffice it to say that there's a lot more work to be done. We aim to ground this model much more strongly in empirical research. For now, what we hope that the model represents is a possible shift in the way we approach creativity, away from the emphasis on idea generation and more towards the way people deal with raw materials. Perhaps we need to let go a little of our obsession with generativity and originality and look a bit more at how we can help people take a fresh look at what's right in front of them, opening the door for serendipity, if you will. And that could be ideas, it could be problems, it could be products, or even completely random things. So some people see faces everywhere. Other people see things in clouds. Well, okay, the Darwin cloud is an obvious fake, but for example, sometimes you might see jellyfish in clouds or even the Starship Enterprise. But unfortunately, not everyone is enthusiastic about this hobby, but still it's something I can recommend. John Arnold is often quoted as having said or written that the creative process does not end with an idea, but starts with an idea. And we believe this may be true in a very literal sense. A change in the way we view a problem, the ideas we find ourselves coming up with, the criteria by which we evaluate our work, or even the things we find ourselves doing with a product after implementation, all of these are triggered or sparked by an idea. Ideas are popularly represented as a light bulb, but perhaps Newton's apple is a better metaphor. Life throws apples at us all the time. Don't try to dodge them, but try to put them to use. That's all. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic and well worth the 18 months wait from when I first read the abstract. Thank you ever so much.
Glad to hear it.
And in fact, I was taking photos of your slides and sending them to Margaret Webb, who I don't think you were. She's in Australia, so she was here in the very early morning shift. And I think there were some really significant overlaps in your work. She was looking at ratings of positive schizotypy and how people judge alternative uses tasks, so that individual differences approach, and there were some really palpable overlaps. So I think it'd be useful to look that up.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad the whole thing is being recorded, so I can look everything back later on.
I'm high in positive schizotypy, but I can see all the connections that are being made. It's fantastic. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask? We do actually have about 5 minutes for questions, so that's perfect timing as well. Thank you so much, Eric. Does anybody have any questions? A reminder again that we are streaming live on YouTube, so for the people that are there, if you don't want your voice broadcast on YouTube, you would need to put your question in the chat. No, okay, so I wanted to ask you then, what it feels to me, or to check like I sort of understood the argument that you're making, what it feels to me then is you're arguing to accept the subjectivity in creativity assessments rather than try to spend all our time controlling it out, because if we're measuring creativity at its core, creativity is subjective. Would that be correct?
Yes, yeah, that's exactly correct. So I think that I mean, my own research has also focused on sort of trying to figure out why people sort of make the wrong choice when it comes to selecting ideas. But I think now that maybe that was the wrong question to ask, and the same is true when it comes to evaluations. We tend to want to get people to be more accurate when it comes to evaluating creativity. But I think that what we should be asking instead is why it is that some people find an idea creative and others don't. And there will probably be individual differences playing a role there. There's also going to be situational factors that play a role there. And I think that this is what we might want to focus on a little bit more, rather than sort of ignoring all of those differences as differences in accuracy and saying that some people don't recognize creativity when in fact it's there. I think that might be the wrong way to go about it.
Okay, fantastic. I completely concur. I think it's wonderful. I think, Vlad, you had your hand up. Would you like to unmute and ask a question? I don't know if you're talking, your mouth's moving, but we can't hear you.
Oh yeah, okay. Several buttons to press. Is it okay now?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
So my question is, how do you think this theory would apply to fields with higher material engagement, if you will? So fields which are not as driven by ideas that you sit down and come up with, but things that you produce. So music, for example, or any other kind of more craft-like activity.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And actually, one of the papers that I've been reading and I'm in the process of using in developing this theory is a paper by Withagen and Van der Kamp, who take an ecological perspective on creativity and basically argue that creativity is a matter of discovering new affordances in the way you interact with your physical environment. And I think that approach actually might capture something important about what you're referring to here, because it really is about the way people deal with things, really. So not just conceptual things. They could also actually be physical objects. They could be musical phrases. They could be things that they see other people doing. And then the question is, how do you respond to that? So, for example, Sawyer's research on improvisational creativity, for example, is probably extremely relevant here. But other research from, for example, design studies and the way people deal with objects and use prototyping and similar things to sort of develop their ideas further, exchange ideas, and thereby in that process generate new ideas is probably very relevant as well. Does this answer your question, or is this just a random?
Yeah, no, not at all. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. There's one other question from Anay, which is in the chat, which is, thank you for this really interesting presentation. If what matters is the perceived creativity, then it might depend on the perception of different people, but also depend as well on the context. So it may not just be individual differences, but it may be contextual differences. How can you take all of these complexities into account and study them?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it's going to be a matter of taking one step at a time. I totally agree that the context is going to be crucially important here. So, for example, Jennifer Mueller has a recent paper where she's on what she calls the decision maker's dilemma, where she argues that the degree to which people recognize or see or are willing to engage with creative ideas depends on the role that they have, for example, in an organizational setting. But yes, I think that the individual or group context will also play a role. Frankly, I hope that a lot of different people are going to engage with this approach, so I don't have to do it all on my own. Because obviously, it's a lot of different factors that play a role here.
Thank you very much. I do really think this is really quite such an interesting work to look at creativity and reaction rather than look at creativity and generation. I think it's fantastic and incredibly important. So thank you for introducing it to us. And I'll certainly be trying to rope in anyone I can to help uncover how we're going to do this. Thank you very much, Eric.
Thank you.